video is the first video for chapter 4, and it's actually going to cover 2 sections. It's going to cover section 4.1 and 4.2. So in this chapter, we're kind of stepping down a level in ecological organization. Last chapter, chapter 3, was really focused on kind of the biosphere level of studying. We were talking about global systems and climate as a global factor within ecology. And now we're looking more at the ecosystem level and looking at how we can study within one ecosystem. So just as a review, an ecosystem is all of the biotic and abiotic factors in one area. So in 4.1 and 4.2, what we're focused on is energy within an ecosystem. So 4.1 is going to focus on energy and the source of energy, and how it gets from the environment into living organisms. So we're going to define primary producers and describe how consumers obtain energy and nutrients. So before we start, pause for a minute, and I want you to write down what you already know about this topic. Go ahead and include vocabulary, define things that you already know, draw pictures, diagrams, label things, but stop for a second and think about what you already know, because you probably know a whole lot more about this topic than you realize. When you're ready, then go ahead and start the video again, and we'll continue. Okay, now that you've had a chance to do that, let's move on. So to start off with, we have the sources of energy within an ecosystem. And the primary process that converts energy into an ecosystem is photosynthesis. So photo, light, synthesis, creating. So in this case, you're using light energy plus carbon dioxide and water to build the carbohydrates that will be used to make up living organisms and that will be used for energy conversions to run life processes. You also produce some oxygen in that process, and we'll spend a lot more time with photosynthesis and just photosynthesis later on in the unit. Another process that you may not have heard of before that functions within deep sea hydrothermal vent ecosystems is called chemosynthesis. And this is a way of, again, getting energy from the environment into living things. So chemo, think chemical synthesis, creating. In this case, you're using inorganic compounds. So compounds that are not associated with living organisms, and using them to produce organic compounds, or compounds that are associated with living organisms. So it's a process that uses carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen sulfide from these deep sea vents. So you already have a chemical energy form, and you're just converting that into the carbohydrates that are needed for living organisms. And you also meaning the bacteria that carry out this process, also release some sulfur compounds. But from there, then the energy can move through the rest of the living organisms. So types of organisms, we can classify organisms for how they get their energy. So the first group would be the producers. These are the ones that are actually carrying out photosynthesis or chemosynthesis in order to produce their own organic molecules and their own stored energy. We also call these organisms autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means feeding. So they are self-feeders. They can feed themselves. This includes plants, some bacteria, and some protists, particularly the algae, the protists that we call algae, which are photosynthetic protists. Okay. The other organisms we classify as consumers because they have to consume their food. The other word for that is heterotroph. Hetero, other, troph, feeding. So they have to feed by eating other organisms. This includes kingdom Animalia, kingdom fungi, some bacteria, and again, some protists. Okay. They could also be classified then, the consumers can be classified as decomposers, carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores, though primarily we use these terms for animals or other, the carnivore, herbivore, omnivore terms are usually used to describe animals. Decomposers can be a variety of organisms. So carnivores are types of consumers that eat only meat and other animals. Herbivores are types of animals and types of consumers that are eating Producers, so they're directly eating the plants for their food source. And omnivores, omni means all, vor, feeding, so they are all eating. They can eat all types of organisms. Other types of consumers could be detritivores that live off of and eat decomposing matter. Decomposers will directly decompose and break down the organic material and use that as their food source. So these are things like fungi and bacteria. And then we have scavengers, which are, again, eating dead organisms. So I know my definitions are getting a little vague. That's why I've put some links to more information so that it's easier to distinguish between them. So please check out the links in the PowerPoint directly. Okay, so that wraps up section 4.1. What we're going to move into in 4.2 is how energy is flowing throughout the entire ecosystem and how they're flowing through different organisms. So we're going to look at how energy flows and then also analyze a type of diagram called an ecological pyramid to analyze how that energy is moving through what we call the trophic levels. So we have two types of diagrams that are used when describing energy flow in an ecosystem. The first, the simplest one, is a food chain, which shows a series of organisms in which energy is transferred from one organism to another. So it's just one link from one producer to one later consumer. A food web, however, is going to give you a better picture of the entire ecosystem. It's going to show a network of feeding interactions through which both energy and matter move. So you can think of a food web as a bunch of interconnecting food chains. Okay. There's a really good video embedded in the PowerPoint again, or you can just Google it, but it's the Amoeba Sisters Food Web and Energy Pyramids video, which does a good job of explaining these as well, if you want another resource. So if we're looking at food chains, it's going to start with one producer, show the flow of energy to what we call the primary consumer, the first level consumer. From there, the flow of energy to the secondary consumer, and from there to the tertiary consumer, the third level consumer. You rarely will go much beyond this, and we'll talk about why in a minute. So there's an example from the grass, the producer, to the herbivore, the grasshopper that's eating it, or it could be an omnivore, depends. And then we have the energy flowing from the grasshopper to the mouse when the mouse eats the grasshopper, and then it flows from the mouse to the owl here. So keep in mind the arrow directions in this case are showing the way that the energy is moving. So it's moving from the producer to the primary consumer. That's why the arrow goes from the grass to the grasshopper, and etc. with the rest of them. Follows the same pattern in a food web, but now we're looking at the entire ecosystem as a whole. You'll get a better idea of relationships between organisms and a bigger picture of the entire ecosystem and how maybe a change in one organism can affect the entire ecosystem. You'll notice, for example, like the squirrel has lots of different arrows feeding off of it, so there's lots of things that get energy from the squirrel, and it only has one that's leading towards it, so it gets its energy from only one source. So you could trace multiple food webs that involve like the grass to the deer, to the spider, and I can't tell where it's going from there, but you could trace the grass to the grasshopper, to the mouse, to the hawk, or to the owl, or to the fox. That would be an example. Oops, that disappeared. Let's bring it back. Okay. So before we start talking about the energy pyramids, this is based off of something called the rule of 10. And this idea says that only 10% of the energy at one trophic level is actually transferred to the next trophic level. And that's because most of it's lost to normal metabolic functions, growth, heat, reproduction. So it's either like used or it's just not transferred efficiently. So for example, if 100% of the energy that's available to primary producers, only 10% of that's going to the first level consumers, which means only 1% of that energy that was available to the primary producers is going to the secondary consumers, etc. And this is what's going to limit how many trophic levels that you have within one food chain, because you're going to get to the point where there's just not enough efficient energy transfer, and they would have to eat a significant amount of mass in order to get enough energy. So pyramids of biomass and numbers, these are other types of ecological pyramids. So the one we just looked at is just tracing the amount of energy, and it has that particular shape. It's called an energy pyramid. But if we go back, the biomass and numbers would be very similar. So biomass is the total mass available at each trophic level. So the producers always represent our first trophic level, the primary consumers represent our second trophic level, etc. And so you generally have the most biomass in the first trophic level in the producers. Okay, and the same thing will follow with numbers. So there's some exceptions to that with things like aquatic ecosystems where, you know, the numbers, you might have a very large whale and there's only one, but it's a large amount of biomass and it's a large amount of energy that is within that organism. So they can vary a little bit. Again, there's another link here for another resource if you need it. Okay, and that ends that section. So I will save cycles of matter for another group, but this is the final part of energy. So make sure you're comfortable with producers versus consumers, the different types of consumers and all that vocabulary. And you also understand the rule of 10 and energy pyramids as well. Oh, and food webs and food chains and the differences between the two. Make sure you understand which direction the arrow flows.